To our top story, that Gavin Williamson has been sacked as Defence Secretary following an inquiry into a leak from a top-level National Security Council meeting. Downing Street said the Prime Minister had lost confidence in his ability to serve, and Penny Mordaunt will replace him in the role. In a statement released in the last few minutes, Penny Mordaunt said, "I'm delighted to be back at the Ministry of Defence. It is an honour and privilege to work with the best armed forces and defence civilians in the world." Well, we can cross now to our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, who's in Central Lobby for us on what is turning out to be rather a busy evening, Vicky.
That's right, a sudden dismissal for Gavin Williamson. The news broke just before 6 o'clock this evening. We understand the Prime Minister was briefed after Prime Minister's questions this afternoon. Then she spoke to Mr Williamson at around 5 o'clock here in the Commons in her office. Now, according to her letter, she says that there was compelling evidence suggesting his responsibility for the unauthorised disclosure. This was from the National Security Council, of course, a collection of senior cabinet ministers who get together with the security forces and others to discuss highly confidential, what are supposed to be highly confidential matters. There was a leak on this occasion about the Chinese telecoms firm Huawei and them getting involved in 5G production here in Britain. Now, she does say that there is no other credible version of events to explain this leak. Now, that is being absolutely dismissed by Gavin Williamson. He has said that he didn't do it, he would never do such a thing, and he really has a swipe at the inquiry, an investigation that was being led by the most senior civil servant in government, Sir Mark Sedwill. And in his letter to the Prime Minister, Gavin Williamson said, "I am confident that a thorough and formal inquiry would have vindicated my position." Now, Mr Williamson's friends think basically that he has been stitched up. They talk about a rather acrimonious relationship between those two men, and they think that he is being stitched up. He hasn't done it and will continue to defend himself. Now, of course, it means another cabinet reshuffle. As you said there, Penny Mordaunt has been made Defence Secretary. She will be the first female Defence Secretary that the UK has had, and she spoke to us a little bit earlier.
Well, it is a huge privilege to be back at the Ministry of Defence and to be asked to work with the best armed forces in the world. And I'm very much looking forward to getting on with the job.
Can I ask you about your predecessor? He tonight has emphatically denied that he was behind the leaks from the National Security Council. Do you believe him? And if not, what should happen next? Should there be a criminal inquiry?
Well, the Prime Minister's made her decision. What I'm focused on is getting on with the job. And it's a huge privilege to be asked to work with the best armed forces in the world. Thank you.
The new Defence Secretary, Penny Mordaunt there, she chose not to answer the question about whether there should potentially be a criminal inquiry now, but it is a question that many people are raising, Vicky.
Yeah, because ministers have to sign the Official Secrets Act, and if that is broken, then there is an argument for the police to be involved. Now, there is an issue here, of course. Mr Williamson absolutely strenuously denying that he did this, that he was responsible, or that any of his team were responsible for this leak. And he says that there hasn't been any compelling evidence. We understand that there has been a phone record shown to him showing a phone call between himself and the journalist who got the leak, but I think their argument would be, well, that doesn't prove what they were talking about, and that, you know, lots of ministers, lots of MPs speak to journalists all the time. So Downing Street, really, because Mr Williamson is denying this so emphatically, are coming under pressure to come up with the compelling evidence. Now, there's no sign of that at the moment. Downing Street insisting that they think that this is the end of the matter. But if Mr Williamson doesn't go quietly, then it seems hard to see how it will be.
OK, Vicky, for now, thank you very much indeed. Vicky Young there, live for us in Westminster. Well, we can speak now to Anthony Glees, the Director of the Centre for Security and Intelligence Studies at the University of Buckingham. Very good of you to join us this evening. It's been a very busy evening. What do you make of it?
Well, it's a very, very serious matter. I think we're in a very grave crisis for the government. We're also in a very grave crisis for the governance, because the governance of the United Kingdom, because the National Security Council sits right at the apex of our national security machinery. A leak from it is a very, very damaging thing for the credibility of our government and for the way in which we're seen throughout the world. The fact that this was a leak about the security issues posed by allowing Huawei to get into the proposed 5G network. So an inquiry, a discussion of a security problem with Huawei, which itself was leaked. That's a terrible, terrible thing. And the Chinese, for one, will be laughing themselves silly this evening. But it's serious for many other reasons, too. It was clear that as there are only two groups of people on the National Security Council, the spooks and the ministers, it was either the spooks that had done the leaking or the ministers. And it is also the fact that the leak was deeply embarrassing to the Prime Minister because it implied that, contrary to the advice of the spooks, she had decided to proceed with the Huawei project, even though the United States of America was saying that if we were to proceed with the Huawei project, the United States of America would deny us access to the secret intelligence on which our country relies so hugely, both for our own national security, but also as an offer we make to demonstrate we have global reach in the world outside the United Kingdom. So if this weren't so serious, you'd call it an omni-shambles. And it's hard, actually, to exaggerate the very, very dark place we are in tonight.
You clearly see this as very severe. Other people saying, well, obviously a leak in itself is something to be troubled by, but the actual substance of this leak was not confidential, classified information. It was more to do with the discussion that went on and the disagreement between cabinet colleagues. So the material that was released, in a sense, was not of a secret nature.
Well, I would say to that, first of all, you've got the reaction of the United States of America, which is very serious. I believe they've only withheld intelligence from us once in 1970. And that was very, very serious when it happened. So for that reason alone, if the leak is correct and Theresa May was going with Huawei, then the consequences for our relationship with the United States of America are very, very severe indeed. But look at it the other way. There's also a Brexit dimension to this. Gavin Williamson, who became a very keen Brexiter, is to be replaced by Penny Mordaunt, also a very keen Brexiter. What do both of them have in common, apart from Brexit? The fact that both of them opposed the Huawei leak. That was in the Telegraph story. So in its own way, this crisis that has been created this evening not only calls into question the judgment of our Prime Minister in respect of Huawei, the judgment of our Prime Minister in respect of whom she makes as our Defence Minister, but it also calls into question the way in which Brexit seems to be this great black hole into which all policy considerations fall and which causes us such huge damage. And we should not underestimate that we have really got the worst of all possible worlds this evening. America is opposed to this policy. The Chinese, as I say, think we're ridiculous. The rest of the world will think we're ridiculous. And Mrs. May has not been secured by replacing one person who opposes her policy with another.
Does this have any implications for the National Security Council itself? It's a relatively new institution, if you can call it that, and it has brought more members of the cabinet into the intelligence community, I suppose, and made them more involved in discussions of that nature. Some people saying, well, by its very nature, you open up a committee like that and there is more risk of leak.
Well, I would disagree with that. I mean, I think the National Security Council, set up, as you say, in 2010 by David Cameron, it was an innovation in a way to override the Joint Intelligence Committee, which had been the previous way of doing this. But what it signified was the absolutely critical importance to our national policy making of the intelligence input into it. You could not have a clearer statement of how important intelligence-led security activity has become to the United Kingdom, whether it is in the fight against Islamism, against other forms of extremism, or also keeping us safe from, let us say, potential threats from Russia or China or anywhere else in the world. That is it's in the eye of the storm, that National Security Council. And if it cannot deliberate in secret, if those who are charged with making secret policy on our behalf cannot keep those secrets to government, to the decision makers, if they can't be confident that the truths that they believe they have are spoken unto those with power, the Prime Minister, without there being a fear of leak, then they simply won't be able to do their job. And if they can't do their job, then one of the core duties of government, which is to keep us safe, is thrown to the four winds. That's why this is so very, very serious.
OK. Anthony Gleeser, very good of you to give us your analysis this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
I swear on my children's lives, I did not do it. That's what the man who was sacked last night as Defence Secretary Gary Williamson says. Absolutely adamant that he didn't leak information from a secret government security committee to a newspaper journalist. You may not have come across Mr. Williamson, so here he is in action when he first got the job as Defence Secretary.
Frankly, Russia should go away and should shut up.
That's what he said to the Russians. Let's run that one by you again.
Frankly, Russia should go away and should shut up.
Now the Prime Minister has told Gary Williamson to go away himself because, in her view, he didn't shut up. Mrs May sacked him for disclosing plans to allow the Chinese telecoms giant Huawei to help build the UK's 5G mobile phone network. In the letter, Mrs May wrote to Mr Williamson, sacking him. She said there was compelling evidence suggesting your responsibility for the leak. Mr Williamson wrote back, "With this, I strenuously deny that I was in any way involved in this leak." And he's quoted in newspapers as saying he is the victim of a vendetta and a kangaroo court. Let's talk to two Conservative MPs. Bob Seeley, who is a former Army sergeant and sits on the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and Colonel Bob Stewart, who commanded UN forces in Bosnia, now a Conservative MP as well. Thank you both very much for coming on the programme. Bob Stewart, who do you believe, Theresa May or Gavin Williamson?
I don't know, but let's be quite clear. This is should not be a political decision. This is a criminal decision. When Bob and myself were in the armed forces, we signed something called the Official Secrets Act. When you sign the Official Secrets Act, you realise that if you breach security, if you tell something you shouldn't do, you will be charged and brought before a court, maybe a court-martial or a civilian court. I don't think this is a political matter. I think this is a criminal matter. And I think, as Williamson has said, I absolutely protest my innocence in this matter. And even the Prime Minister said there was not conclusive evidence, there was compelling evidence, but not conclusive evidence that he did it. I think the police should investigate this matter.
But it sounds like, sorry to interrupt, Mr. Stewart, it sounds like you think the Prime Minister's got it wrong.
I don't know. Who knows whether the Prime Minister's got it wrong? But one thing I don't like is the idea that a Cabinet Secretary does a quick and dirty investigation about a criminal matter, not a political matter, and it's a criminal matter. And if Williamson has got it wrong, he should be in a cell. He shouldn't be walking around. And the only way we can discover that is if there's a proper investigation.
Bob Seeley, who do you believe?
I presume the Prime Minister has her facts right. I can't say for certain because I wasn't part of the investigation.
So Gavin Williamson is lying?
Well, I hear what Gavin says, and the truth may be more complex. I don't know. I wasn't there. I respect the Prime Minister's decision. I also respect, morning Bob, I also respect very much what Colonel Stewart says. Don't take entirely the same point of view. I, like Bob, signed the Official Secrets Act. If I had been leaking information, three things would have happened: disciplined, sacked, or potentially prosecuted in worst case scenarios. Gavin Williamson wasn't leaking lists of agents in Russia or high-tech specs of kit. This was a political leak, and he's paid a significant price, and one should not underestimate it, and one shouldn't leak. But there was politics behind that, and that was this...
Well, if Mrs May doesn't have the confidence of her Defence Secretary, then it's within her gift to get rid of him.
Yeah.
And Bob Stewart, according to our political editor, Mr Williamson has admitted that he talked to this journalist in question at the Daily Telegraph, but is adamant that he wasn't the one who leaked the information. Is that just a coincidence?
Who knows? Neither Bob or I or anyone else knows, and that's why a proper investigation is required. Because
okay, we're just going to pause there. I'm so sorry. We are actually going to go to the House of Commons because Labour's Tom Watson is asking the government an urgent question about this very issue.
I've seen the material we share with each other in total confidence. In his defiant challenge, the former Defence Secretary has put the Prime Minister's integrity and judgment in the spotlight. Whether he is guilty or not should be a question for the criminal justice system. The question the Minister has to answer today is he confident that the Prime Minister's decision to allow Huawei to participate in our 5G networks keeps this country safe and protects our intelligence relationships with our allies?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is eliding a number of different subjects in his questions to me. On the question of the substance of the government's policy decisions, it has been said from this dispatch box already on a number of occasions that the review of 5G networks being carried out by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, is a matter of public record. The government has committed to telling this House of its conclusions once those decisions have been taken and approved at all levels within government, and we're ready to bring that information to this House. And that will be the time for this House to both learn what the government has decided and to hold ministers to account for their decisions. I can reiterate to the House, Mr. Speaker, that the government's priorities for the future of telecommunications remain stronger cybersecurity practices, greater resilience throughout telecommunications networks, and diversity in the marketplace. As has again been said before from this dispatch box, this is a policy challenge that goes beyond a single company or even a single country. We continue to work very closely with all of our Five Eyes allies and with other international partners. The problem about this particular case was not so much the question of the material that was disclosed, but the forum from which the leak came. And it was to maintain the integrity and secrecy essential for the proper conduct of the business of the government of the United Kingdom, whichever party happens to be in office, that caused the Prime Minister to set up the inquiry and to take the decisions that she took yesterday. The inquiry, as far as I am aware, took place on the basis of confidentiality throughout its proceedings. It came to conclusions that were reported to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, and she has taken the decisions that she announced yesterday. This boils down, Mr. Speaker, to what is set out in the Ministerial Code at paragraph 1.6, which states that ministers only remain in office for so long as they retain the confidence of the Prime Minister. She is the ultimate judge of the standards of behaviour expected of a minister and the appropriate consequences of a breach of those standards.
David Lidington. David Lidington, that is the Prime Minister's deputy, effectively. Was our national security at risk, Bob Seeley?
No, not from this leak. I don't think it was.
It's disclosure.
Leaking isn't good, as we've said, but actually there is a very important debate that's now happening that wouldn't have happened. So there is a silver lining to this leak, and that is we're going to make some very, very important decisions about the security of our communications networks. It's going to last decades into the future, and we need an open debate, and I'm worried that these decisions have already effectively been made, and they are the wrong decisions, because our Five Eyes colleagues, our closest allies, Australia, America, Canada, New Zealand, several of them have already said no to Huawei and no to Chinese kit in their infrastructure. That's
so if it was Gavin Williamson, and he adamantly denies it, Mrs May says there's compelling evidence, actually you say he did the right thing because it started that debate.
I'm saying there's a public interest defence. Doesn't say it's right to leak, but what I'm saying is that some good may have come out of that, which is that we're having a debate about Huawei, and I hope we come up with the right answer. And I'm concerned that we are not going to. Next week I come out with a detailed Five Nations report written by American, Australian, Canadian experts about why we need to think again about Huawei.
Okay. Thank you, both of you. Thank you very much for your patience as well.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Bob Stewart and Bob Seeley. Thank you.
Tonight, Gavin Williamson has provided the photojournalists with a lifetime of colour and material. He entered politics with his pet tarantula, became known as Private Pike, and along the way got too close to the heat in his former role as a fireplace salesman. He'll be missed by the sketch writers, at least, if not entirely, for his role in shaping defence policy. Here's Michael Cockrell.
I first met Gavin Williamson when he was David Cameron's bag carrier, or parliamentary private secretary. He saw himself as a Machiavellian practitioner of the dark arts of politics. Every week, Williamson would circulate Tory backbenchers with helpful questions for them to ask at Prime Minister's Question Time.
Ahead of PMQs, we get an email. It's just come through at 11:06, and these are some suggested topics that would be helpful. The Prime Minister would be happy to receive a question on.
So which of these? This is an email from the Prime Minister's parliamentary private secretary,
yes,
suggesting questions that you as Conservative MPs.
Yes, exactly.
When Theresa May stood for the leadership after Cameron's resignation, Gavin Williamson managed her successful campaign, and he later reportedly boasted, "I put her in, and I can take her out." Williamson had become like a favourite son, and Mrs May made him chief whip, the government's keeper of the secrets. In his office he kept a pet tarantula to intimidate rebellious MPs, and he called it Cronus, after the Greek god who castrated his own father.
I don't much like the stick, but it is amazing what can be achieved with a sharpened carrot.
Williamson negotiated the deal with the DUP, which kept her in power after she lost her majority in the calamitous 2017 election. Mrs May brought him into the cabinet as Defence Secretary, where he became notorious for his gaffes, like his message to the Russians after the Skripal poisoning.
Frankly, Russia should go away, it should shut up.
Do you regret using very casual Trump-esque language like shut up and go away? Please don't tell me what happened, because we know what happened. Do you regret using that language? That is the question.
Well, what was right is actually we came together with our allies and made it absolutely clear to Russia that they couldn't act in that behaviour, and I think that was the right thing to
Interview terminated because you won't answer the question.
Among the military, Williamson was mockingly nicknamed Private Pike, and it was his inability to answer a straight question from the Cabinet Secretary about the Huawei leak that cost him the job he relished.
Michael Cockrell. We're going to take a look at tomorrow's papers now. There's only one story dominating the headlines. As you can see from the 6 or so pictured there, it's the sacking of Gavin Williamson. We're joined now to discuss the fallout of his departure by the former Director of Communications at Downing Street, Craig Oliver, the Deputy Political Editor of The Spectator, Katie Balls, and the Times Defence Correspondent, Lucy Fisher. Worth just stating, as we've been mentioning Huawei, the company does, of course, deny any wrongdoing and has said allegations that it uses its technology are smears to spy are smears. Katie, can I begin with you? Do you feel you know Gavin Williamson quite well? You're one of the journalists that's often credited with sort of understanding, getting under his skin a bit better than many.
Well, I think he's someone who, come across for a long time now. He's risen through the Conservative Party, and I've followed that. And I think ultimately the news today of his sacking has taken Westminster by surprise. And that's partly because lots of people thought Theresa May didn't necessarily have the political capital to sack a minister, particularly one who she has had such a close relationship to, a former chief whip, someone who helped with her leadership campaign.
It's quite hard to find voices coming out in support. Often that tells you more, doesn't it? The absence of support for a minister.
I think it can do. I do think that there are lots of people trying to wait to see what exactly is the evidence behind the reasoning behind Number 10's decision. You have seen a couple of MPs, Nadine Dorris for one, come out and question whether Theresa May has treated him well. I wouldn't say the chorus is that loud, but I am sensing some unease amongst Tory MPs as to whether there is specific evidence or if it's a case of something being circumstantial.
Craig, just talk us through the anatomy of a sacking. We've used this word unprecedented. It does feel particularly brutal. Why?
I think it's brutal because I think there's a point at which government feels that we can't take this anymore. When I was in Number 10, there was a spat in the Home Office who slagged off Michael Gove and then leaked a letter from Theresa May about Michael Gove at 1 a.m. on a Twitter feed. And we felt very strongly that we just cannot continue in a situation where this kind of thing is going on in the government. And if we let it pass, then discipline will just be completely out of control. I think that that's what's going on in Number 10 tonight. They feel, look, the NSC is actually quite a precious thing. The ability for the Chief of the Defence Staff, the head of MI5 and MI6 to come into a room and feel that what they say is safe and protected needs to be protected. And I think that that's what's gone on today.
But the protocol is normally a resignation, isn't it? A nicely framed resignation. Here's your letter, sign it. And it comes back. I mean, this was not that. This was you're out of here.
Yes, it's extraordinary, and I think that this word compelling is going to be absolutely crucial. What does Number 10 define as compelling evidence, and do they actually have the thing that can prove that he did it or not? I think the other thing that's interesting that's coming out tonight is that there's this kind of idea that somehow Number 10 and Mark Sedwill are in this conspiracy theory against Gavin Williamson. This is nonsense. The idea that the day before the local election vote that you were going to conspire to get rid of your defence secretary. You might do it on the Friday after to cover up the story then, but to do it the day before, this is just nonsense, and I think it's a sign of how febrile things are.
Lucy, what is your sense from within the MOD tonight? Are people shocked, delighted, in tears?
Well, I think there's been a lot said about the gaffes that Gavin Williamson has made, but I think there was a real sense among a lot of the top brass that he was really committed to the ministry. You know, he fought hard to win 1.8 billion over 2 years for the department. He was ambitious for particularly the Royal Navy, talking about the Global Britain strategy that would see the aircraft carrier going east of Suez. And he's also tried to overrun some of the very wieldy procurement processes with cheaper ways of developing technology-led kit. So I think that there will be people who thought he was less statesman-like than perhaps some of his predecessors, and will be glad to see Penny Mordaunt coming in. But I also think there will be people who will be lamenting his demise.
And will Theresa May be one of them? I mean, when you remove her from her position of having to fight him, she's lost an ally that, brought in the DUP arrangement, right?
Yeah, I think the problem here is Theresa May has relied on Gavin Williamson heavily since getting into Number 10. And even up until a few months ago, when there have been crunch moments, confidence votes against her, I think Gavin Williamson has been in her inner circle. And I think that is something she is going to miss. And if the Tory party have to renegotiate a confidence and supply agreement with the DUP, Gavin Williamson and some of the DUP actually do get on with, and there's not that many figures in cabinet that they do, and I think there is a point where they will miss his efforts and his ability.
Adam Holloway raised this interesting point. He just said that the whole calibre of the cabinet is lacking. I mean, he said across the political class. Is that something you feel widely? You look at the cabinet and just think most of them aren't up to the job.
I think there are some strong people in cabinet, and I do think that there is a wide view that is this one of the strongest cabinets there's been for a while? No. I think a lot of people, when Gavin Williamson was made Defence Secretary, thought very good Chief Whip, a guy who understands the Commons, understands what motivates MPs incredibly well. Is this guy really the Defence Secretary? And when he was making jokes about sharpened carrots and telling Russia to, go away and shut up and that kind of thing, a lot of people thought, hold on a minute, this is a very, very serious job in government. There are a lot of people...
What was he playing to? I mean, what was that about, do you think?
Well, I think that he thought that somehow that this would play well, this would show that he was a character. I think the Conservative Party, got a strong military background, feels Defence Secretary should take the job incredibly seriously, should look very, very much the part. Now, I think Lucy makes a good point. It's fair to say he did do some things that were quite serious and won over some of the generals, but he also did some things that looked immature, looked like, you're not really playing the part of the Defence Secretary very well. And I also just think on Katie's point, I think Number 10 fell out with Gavin Williamson quite a while ago. I don't think recently he's been saying, that a long time ago he said, I made her and I can break her. That sense of distrust has been there for quite a long time, I think.
What's the job ahead for Penny Mordaunt now? I mean, she takes on the Defence Secretary role. Does she have to carry on what he's been doing but in a different manner, or can she completely re-establish that job?
Well, the big question facing her is money. The 10-year defence equipment budget is facing a black hole for funding of 14 billion. She's also got to continue developing policy on boosting Britain's resilience in the face of threats from Russia and China. And then I also think she's got to look ahead to really trying to boost NATO, which earlier this month had a very muted 70th birthday celebration in Washington. The next big summit is in December in London, so she'll be working towards that and fostering international alliances.
I mean, those international alliances, we often hear from Europe what they think, for example, of Boris Johnson. What did America, China, Russia think of Gavin Williamson?
Well, interestingly, he had a fantastic relationship with Jim Mattis. And that was sort of a fascinating thing because they're quite different characters. With Patrick Shanahan, the acting US Defence Secretary, interestingly, he was due to come to London for 2 days on Friday, a trip that was cancelled, the Pentagon suggested, at midday today. So unclear
they probably
quite
knew.
Why.
Does this alter anything that happens tomorrow? I mean, we're sort of getting quite used to weird things happening on the eve of local elections. You know, does it sort of change anything?
I mean, I think if you want to find bad press for the Tories nowadays, it's not very difficult. This might be an additional reason, but I think there's already so many problems when it comes to the local elections that the Tories won't be able to blame a bad result just on what's happened here with Gavin Williamson.
And it feels like we're living in a time where we're so used to the world shaking beneath Westminster's feet that we look back historically and say, well, that would not be sustainable. And actually, we're learning it can be sustainable for much longer. And actually, the key point here, I think, for Theresa May is she's shown herself to be somebody who's willing to take any amount of humiliation in order to keep going and just keep herself in the game with the possibility of delivering Brexit. And I think that that's the really extraordinary fact, is what you're seeing is a Prime Minister who's willing to take a huge amount of humiliation.
Does it make any difference to how she delivers Brexit, any of this? I mean, this is quite an old-fashioned story, isn't it, for our age?
It injects more poison into the Conservative Party, and the issues between MPs at the moment are very serious.
But I think we now have Penny Mordaunt, a committed Brexiteer in a very senior position, ahead of potentially crunch cabinets on a potential customs union. And you also have Gavin Williamson, who knows this government inside out on the backbenches, where he could cause Theresa May trouble.
Thank you all very much indeed. That's all we have time for tonight. Mark Urban is here tomorrow. From all of us here, thanks for watching. Bye-bye. Williamson to leave the government, having lost confidence in his ability to serve. At its heart is the leaking of a National Security Council briefing that discussed the part Chinese firm Huawei might play in the evolution of Britain's 5G broadband development. He vigorously denies that he was responsible for the leak, even telling Sky News that he swore on his children's lives it wasn't him. Williamson was at one time a loyal colleague to the PM, even contributing to her leadership campaign, but was recently seen as one of those jostling to take her job. Here's Nick Watt with an evening of high political drama.
With a swiftness verging on the brutal, Theresa May dispatched the man who'd installed her in number 10. Dispensing with the usual pleasantries, the Prime Minister told her former leadership campaign manager that she blamed him for a recent leak from the National Security Council.
In our meeting this evening, I put to you compelling evidence suggesting your responsibility for the unauthorised disclosure. No other credible version of events to explain this leak has been identified.
This was rapidly followed by a denial from the former Defence Secretary.
I appreciate you offering me the option to resign, but to resign would have been to accept that I, my civil servant, my military advisors, all my staff were responsible. This was not the case.
Sir, are you or any of your officials behind the Huawei leak?
How are you? Absolutely not. A consistent position. Gavin Williamson had been named as one of 5 cabinet ministers who'd raised concerns in the National Security Council about the involvement of Huawei in the new 5G network. The leak suggested that Philip Hammond had been more supportive of the Chinese telecoms giant. Earlier this year, Gavin Williamson had clashed with the Chancellor after announcing the dispatch of Britain's new warship to waters in the Pacific claimed by China. The move forced the Chancellor to cancel a visit to China.
The sacking of a Defence Secretary for an alleged national security leak is unprecedented in the modern era. Tonight, friends of Gavin Williamson are rallying around him, saying it is simply not his style. Other Tories were more hostile. Referring to his Dad's Army nickname, one said to me, "Private Pike has gone. Splendid, splendid." One Tory defence expert called for a sense of perspective. before we start putting this in the same category as Kim Philby, George Blake, or any other famous Cold War spy, there is a big difference in leaking something which is highly classified, secret, technical information on the one hand, or leaking something political, which is what appears to have happened in this case. And what appears to have been leaked is the fact that the Defence Secretary, the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary all feel that it is, shall I say, unwise to allow a communist Chinese-controlled giant telecommunications company like Huawei to worm its way into our critical infrastructure, but that they are nevertheless being overruled by ministers in other departments and conceivably by the First Minister, the Prime Minister herself.
A former Labour Defence Minister said a criminal investigation should be considered.
The most remarkable thing about this, as I say, it is not just, say, an Environment Secretary who's leaked this. This is a Defence Secretary whose daily job is to actually protect secrets and sees information on a daily basis of a highly classified nature. The idea that he thought it was wise or clever to actually leak this information is just remarkable. It's quite clear, I think, that there's got to be serious consideration that he's now prosecuted for this leak.
A feeling of calm at the MOD tonight as the ship of state sails on with Britain's first woman Defence Secretary in Penny Mordaunt. But the ripples from today's sacking may be felt for some time.
That was Nick Water. We can go live to Downing Street now. This was quite a bold, quite a decisive move from the PM, who's often quite cautious about these sort of dismissals, Nick.
That's right. We're often told this is a Prime Minister who has little authority, and then she carries out one of the most ruthless cabinet sackings in recent memory. But I was talking to one member of the cabinet who was expecting this, and they said that there is pretty compelling evidence against Gavin Williamson. There is a feeling in government circles that he did speak to the relevant Daily Telegraph journalist on the day in question. So with that in mind, the big question is, why does the Prime Minister consider this matter closed? Why no criminal investigation? And the clue to that is what this inquiry was designed to do. It was designed to restore confidence in the workings of the National Security Council. And it appears that it's Gavin Williamson's behaviour since that inquiry that was set up that has led to that lack of confidence, not necessarily a piece of absolute slam dunk evidence showing him as the leaker.
So as a result of that, what is Gavin Williamson saying this evening?
Well, he is coming out fighting. I've been speaking to friends who say that we may well eventually find that he is the innocent victim of a great scandal. They're talking about how he fell foul of two really powerful people, the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Mark Sedwell, who led this investigation, and the Chancellor, Philip Hammond. That was obviously in a row last year over defence spending. His friends are saying he saved the Royal Marines in that row. Now, friends are saying that Gavin Williamson, yes, he did speak to the Daily Telegraph journalist, but really good journalists have multiple sources, and he and his friends are absolutely adamant Gavin Williamson was not the source of this leak, and I'm told that the former Defence Secretary is minded to issue this challenge to the Prime Minister. Show me the evidence you've got, because I don't believe you've got it.
Nick, thanks very much. Let's pick up on that. Joining us now is one of Gavin Williamson's predecessors as a Chief Whip, Andrew Mitchell, the Conservative MP and former member of the Armed Forces, Adam Holloway, and the UK's former National Security Advisor, Lord Ricketts. Thanks for joining us. Andrew Mitchell, is it possible that he is an innocent victim of a great scandal?
Well, look, this is a very serious matter indeed. Leaking from this particular committee, the National Security Council, is completely unacceptable. The clue is in the title, that it isn't about national security, and the Prime Minister was quite right to call in the apparatus of the state, the intelligence service, the Cabinet Secretary, and to ask them to get to the bottom of it. And remember that this is the fellow who ran her leadership campaign. He then became her chief whip, probably the closest member of the House of Commons to a prime minister, and she has sacked him tonight. So she must believe she has absolutely compelling evidence, or I am sure she would not do that.
But you know what it's like to not be believed when the establishment turns against you. Do you have any sympathy with the idea that he might actually be telling the truth and he might be the victim of a botched investigation that happened too quickly?
Of course, I have sympathy with him on a personal level. It may be that he has made an error of judgment and that he has paid a very heavy price for that. But look, you know, the people who would have conducted this investigation, I've had the privilege as a minister of working with our intelligence services. They are the very best of the very best, and they would not have served up to the Prime Minister any evidence which led her to this conclusion, given her closeness to the man she was going to sack, unless they were absolutely certain of the ground on which they stood.
This idea that Sitwell could have been out to get him, that there was sort of political bad blood between the two of them, does that sit well with what you know of either side?
I really don't think that is a credible argument. He is not only the Cabinet Secretary, he is also the National Security Advisor. And I just don't think he would play games in that way. This is incredibly serious. You cannot conduct the security, the national security of the state, on the basis that people are leaking. And I think that the Prime Minister was right to call in the Cabinet Secretary. He was right to use all the electronic and other assets of the state to be sure that he came to a conclusion, he got to the bottom of this, and events have then taken their course.
Let me just pick up. I'm going to talk to Peter Ricketts in a second, who can tell us about the national security side of things. But Adam, I wonder if you, Holloway, if you find it ironic that we're always hearing from your party how dangerous Jeremy Corbyn is to national security, and tonight it sounds like it was right in the centre of cabinet.
I think there are two really important issues here. One is the fact that the current political class really doesn't seem to be up to the job, whether it's over this and national security or Brexit or much else. And secondly, how Huawei itself is actually an arm of the Chinese state. And so whoever leaked this, of course they shouldn't have done. But, you know, actually, this is very important stuff. I mean, we're the only one of the Five Eyes countries who are even considering having this backdoor technology. And it's very, very dangerous, both those points, political class and Huawei.
You seem to be sort of, you know, ambivalent or straddling two horses there. When you talk about the current political class, do you genuinely think the cabinet isn't up to the job?
Yeah, I think we've ended up in a strange position where politics has sort of become almost a game. I don't think we have the seriousness of generations before. People tend, I think, nowadays to rise in politics precisely because they demonstrate the good qualities of followers rather than leadership. People won't go very far in politics if they demonstrate moral courage, ideas, conviction, the ability to co-opt people into teams.
You were in the armed forces. Did he have the support and the confidence of the armed forces?
Well, I don't know. I just think most of the cabinet will be very unlikely to rise to the rank of general, and that's right across Parliament now. Because as I say, if you want to rise, you have to act like a good follower, and then you see people popping up at the very top with none of the qualities of leadership, blinking, faced with the challenge. You know, we're seeing it right now with the Prime Minister.
Peter Ricketts, Adam Holloway raised an interesting point, which is, you know, we are talking about a leak about Huawei at the centre of this, a company that many people would have qualms about. Maybe he was right, if he did leak it, to bring it to the surface.
Well, he wasn't right to do a leak of any kind, because this was a body that we set up in 2010 when David Cameron came into government as the place where ministers and their most senior officials can talk about the most sensitive state secrets. And as soon as you get to a position where people can feel that they can walk out, maybe they've lost an argument around the table, and instead of keeping their mouth shut, go off and brief the press to try and preempt a government announcement, then the National Security Council isn't going to work.
But you've just said it. This wasn't a state secret. This was just a government announcement. I mean, surely you treat that differently, don't you?
No, because the argumentation that was going on around the table will have been drawing on intelligence information. They're weighing up our security interests in China against our economic interests. There has to be a safe space where ministers can do that, where they can take the most sensitive information and decide what the policy is going to be on the basis of it. That's why it's so toxic, because it will have sent a signal to the intelligence professionals and the civil service that political infighting was polluting even our national security discussions.
You think it changes the way the NSC works
Well, it's the first time in 9 years that there's been a serious leak out of the NSC. It was a place where people could be confident that secrets would be kept. This was very toxic, and I'm glad that the Prime Minister has moved decisively to show that she's not prepared to tolerate leaking.
Has she moved decisively enough? I mean, she seems to be closing the door to any further investigation or police investigation.
And I don't know why she's doing that. I mean, on the face of it, this is a breach of the Official Secrets Act. All the ministers and officials around the table will have signed that. So it seems to me that the police ought to be considering, is there a case to be considered there? It would be for the Director of Public Prosecutions to make the decision, not ministers. But the key thing is she sent a very strong deterrent signal that discussions in the NSC have got to stay confidential, even if in our current state of politics, pretty much everything else out of Cabinet and so on gets leaked.
Andrew Mitchell, I wonder if you agree with your colleague Adam Holloway that this is so endlessly damaging, even this kind of fast move from the Prime Minister just sort of redirects the gaze to the chaos that is literally live within her own cabinet, her own most trusted colleagues.
Well, this is not a good time for British politics, for Parliament and for the government, and we've got to get through it. But I agree with Lord Ricketts. The position that has been investigated is a very serious matter. It's not about Huawei, it's about leaking from the National Security Committee, and that is simply not acceptable. And that's why the government and the Prime Minister were absolutely right to take it extremely seriously, use all the apparatus they could, and get to a resolution, which does appear to have happened tonight.
Quite hard to find supporters, friends of Gavin Williamson tonight. I wonder if you think there was a sort of a vague snobbery about all the, the tarantulas and the, whatever it was, the private pike and the shut up and go away stuff. Do you think people decided early that he wasn't up to the job and shut the door on him?
Well, I think, we do have a problem with where people get great officers of state when they haven't had a great track record of achievement elsewhere. But actually, to stick up for Gavin Williamson, my friends from when I was in the army who are now generals actually say that they were pleasantly surprised about how he performed and that he did actually stick up for the armed forces.
But I do think it is crazy to suggest that Mark Sedwill might have approached this in some sense as a personal grudge match with the minister. I mean, he's a highly professional civil servant in the most exposed position in the country as a civil servant. This was a very, very serious charge, and I am quite sure he will have approached it professionally.
And if as a result of this, the Huawei part in the deal of 5G goes ahead, we move swiftly on, is that a resolution that you will welcome?
Well, first of all, of course, we don't know what the government's position is, because this leak is a partial account of the argument. We're still waiting to see what the announcement is. And indeed, Huawei already exists in our telecoms network. The issue is how much more do we add to it?
Huawei is like the East India Company. It is an arm of the Chinese state. Major Ren, who set it up, is a member of the People's Liberation Army beforehand, member of the National Congress of the Communist Party. His startup money from the Chinese state. Might he have been doing us all a favour by just letting that?
Well,
we don't know that he did it. We don't know that he did it, of course. But these are two separate things. The fact you have an environment where cabinet ministers leak, and the fact that we're in danger of being the only member of the Five Eyes incorporating this technology just when we're going into the Internet of Things, where even your printer tells Hewlett-Packard how many bits of paper you use. This is bonkers.
Okay.
I mean, that's an argument that we should have, but it's not about leaking from the NSC.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. A little earlier, I spoke to Labour's Shadow Defence Minister, Nia Griffiths, and I asked her what she made of such a dramatic sacking.
Well, quite frankly, it's a very shocking thing to have done, and I think we are deeply disturbed that a member of the National Security Council should be leaking information.
He says he didn't do it.
Well, quite clearly there's a real problem. I mean, this is a place where the absolute utmost intelligence, the top security items are discussed, and it should be a place where that can be done freely without the members there being worried that somebody is leaking. And so clearly there's a real breakdown in discipline, and Theresa May now needs to take absolutely firm action. And quite frankly, I think she needs to call in the police and have a full investigation, because we are talking about actually breaking the Official Secrets Act, and actually there may well be a case to answer here.
It sounds like she shut it down. She said it's not going to go any further. There won't be a police inquiry.
Well, that's why we are calling for her to come to Parliament tomorrow and make a proper statement, so that we can ask her exactly what is going on and what she intends to do about it, because this has really undermined confidence in the government and confidence in her as Prime Minister, not just here in the UK, but of course amongst our allies as well.
But he didn't leak anything sensitive. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? He might have leaked a bit of government policy that wasn't known, but it wasn't like that was classified information itself.
Well, I think the point is when you have a discussion of that nature, you want to have that discussion in absolute confidence that you know that nobody there is going to leak that information, so you can discuss freely some very sensitive issues, and you can have that discussion in a proper adult manner, and you can have proper briefings from the security services. Otherwise, they're going to have to limit what they can brief you on.
Do you think what he did was treacherous?
I think it was absolutely treacherous, both to the country but also to the Prime Minister. If you're going to run a government, you need loyalty from your ministers, you need loyalty from your cabinet, and particularly, obviously, those who take part in the National Security Council. And it just shows that, quite frankly, we have here a case of yet another Tory minister putting leadership ambition before the good of the country.
Unless you say that the substance of this was his concerns over Huawei's involvement in the 5G network. Now, if you believe, as many do, that Huawei is an arm of the Chinese state, isn't it right to be concerned about that?
There's a proper way of doing it, and that is internally. That is within that National Security Council, and that is by talking to the Prime Minister directly. It is not by going to the press and leaking. That is not a way to make government policy. It's not a way to make government policy. It's not a way to effectively blackmail the government into doing something.
People are about to go to the polls. I mean, literally tomorrow. I wonder if people just think, you know, there's a leak, there's the inquiry, it's the politics of the thick of it, and we're just going to face a plague on all your houses. You know, all politics feels a bit rotten at the moment here.
I think it really does undermine people's confidence in government when they see this sort of thing happening. And I think that is the detriment of all of us, because, yes, it does undermine what's going on. It also reminds people that the government is not concentrating on the issues that they really worry about. They worry about the number of police on their streets, they worry about the health service, they worry about the money the councils don't have to provide the local services. And what they're seeing is a government riven with division and leadership ambition, and not actually getting on with the job of making their lives better.
Lee Griffiths, thank you. Thanks very much. We'll return to this story in a few moments. The veteran political broadcaster Michael Cockrell brings us a profile of the former Defence Secretary. But first, even leak subterfuge and public sackings don't come close to what is arguably the most serious threat facing humanity. MPs today debated how to solve the climate change crisis ahead of a key report tomorrow that will call for more ambitious targets.